This is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Part 1, Chapter 12. On the following morning, the entire neighborhood wore a festive air because Okonkwo's friend Obirika was celebrating his daughter's Yuri. It was the day on which her suitor, having already paid the greater of her bride price, would bring palm wine not only to her parents and immediate relatives, but to the wide and extensive group of kinsmen called Umnuna. Everybody had been invited, men, women, and children, but it was really a woman's ceremony, and the central figures were the bride and her mother. As soon as day broke, breakfast was hastily eaten, and women and children began to gather at Obirika's compound to help the bride's mother in her difficult but happy task of cooking for a whole village. Okonkwo's family was austere like any other family in the neighborhood. Inoye's mother and Okonkwo's youngest wife were ready to set out for Obirika's compound with all their children. Inoye's mother carried a basket of cocoa yams, a cake of salt, and a smoked fish, which she would present to Obirika's wife. Okonkwo's youngest wife, Ojigo, also had a basket of plantains and cocoa yams and a small pot of palm oil. Their children carried pots of water. Ekwefi tried and sleepy from exhausted experiences of the previous night. It was not very long since they had returned. The priestess with Nzima sleeping on her back had crawled out of the shrine on her belly like a snake. She had not as much as looked at Okonkwo and Ekwefi, or shown any surprise at finding them at the mouth of the cave. She looked straight ahead of her and walked back to the village. Okonkwo and his wife followed her at a respectful distance. They thought the priestess might be going to her house, but she went to Okonkwo's compound, passed through his obi and into Ekwefi's hut, and walked into her bedroom. She placed Nzima carefully on the bed and went away without saying a word to anybody. Nzima was still sleeping when everyone else was astir, and Ekwefi asked Inoye's mother and Ojigo to explain to Obirika's wife that she would be late. She had got ready for her basket of cocoa yams and fish, but she must wait for Nzima to wake. "You need some sleep yourself," said Inoye's mother. "You look very tired." As they spoke, Nzima emerged from the hut, rubbing her eyes and stretching her spare frame. She saw the other children with their water pots and remembered that they were going to fetch water for Obirika's wife. She went back to the hut and brought her pot. "Have you slept enough?" asked her mother. "Yes," she replied. "Let us go." "Not before you have had your breakfast," said Ekwefi, and she went into the hut to warm the vegetable soup she had cooked last night. "We shall be going," said Inoye's mother. "I will tell Obirika's wife that you are coming later." And so they all went to help Obirika's wife, Inoye's mother with her 4 children and Ojigo with her 2. As they trooped through Okonkwo's obi, he asked, "Who will prepare my afternoon meal?" "I shall return to do it," said Ojigo. Okonkwo was also feeling tired and sleepy, for although no one else knew it, he had not slept at all last night. He had felt very anxious, but did not show it. When Ekwefi had followed the priestess, he had allowed what he regarded as a responsible and manly interval to pass, and then gone with his machete to the shrine, where he thought they must be. It was only when he had got there that it had occurred to him that the priestess might have chosen to go round the villages first. Okonkwo had returned home and sat waiting. When he thought he had waited long enough, he returned to the shrine, but the hills and caves were as silent as death. It was only on his 4th trip that he found Ekwefi. By then, he had become gravely worried. Obirika's compound was as busy as an anthill. Temporary cooking tripods were erected on every available space by bringing together 3 blocks of sun-dried earth, and making a fire in their midst. Cooking pots went up and down the tripods, and fufu was pounded in in 100 wooden mortars. Some of the women cooked the yams and the cassava, and others prepared the soup. Young men pounded the fufu or split firewood. The children made endless trips to the stream. 3 young men helped Obirka to slaughter the 2 goats with which the soup was made. They were very fat goats, but the fattest of all was tethered to a peg near the wall of the compound. It was as big as a small cow. Obirka had sent one of his relatives all the way to Imuke to buy the goat. It was the one he would present alive to his in-laws. The market of Imuke is a wonderful place, said the young man who had been sent by Obirka to buy the giant goat. There are so many people on it that if you threw up a grain of sand, it would not find a way to fall to earth again. It is the result of the great medicine, said Obirka. The people of Imuke wanted their market to grow and shallow up the markets of their neighbors, so they made a powerful medicine. Every market day before the first cock crow, this medicine stands on the market ground in the shape of an old woman with a fan. With this magic fan, she beckons to the market all the neighboring clans. She beckons in front of her and the market behind her, to her right, and to her left. And so everybody comes, said another man, honest men and thieves. They can steal your cloth from off your waist in that market. Yes, said Obirka. I warned Inwako to keep a sharp eye and a sharp ear. There was once a man who went to sell a goat. He led it on a thick rope, which he tied around his waist. But as he walked through the market, he realized that people were pointing at him as they do a madman. He could not understand it until he looked back and saw that what he had led at the end of the tether was not a goat, but a heavy log of wood. Do you think a thief can do that kind of thing single-handed? Said Inwanko. No, said Obirka. They used medicine. When they had cut the goats' throats and collected the blood in a bowl, they held them over an open fire to burn off the hair. And the smelling of burning hair blended with the smell of cooking. Then they washed them and cut them up for the woman who prepared the soup. After this anthill activity was going smoothly, when a sudden interruption came. It was a cry in the distance. Oji, Odu, Aku, Ayiyi, O, the one that uses its tail to drive flies away. Every woman immediately abandoned whatever she was doing and rushed out in the direction of the cry. We cannot all rush out like that, leaving what we are cooking to burn in the fire, shouted Cielo, the priestess. 3 or 4 of us should stay behind. It is true, said another woman. We will allow 3 or 4 women to stay behind. 5 women stayed behind to look after the cooking pots, and the rest rushed away to see the cow that had been let loose. When they saw it, they drove it back to its owner, who had once paid the heavy fine which the village imposed on anyone whose cow was let loose on his neighbor's crops. When the woman had exacted the penalty, they checked among themselves to see if any woman had failed to come out when the cry had been raised. "Where is Mbogo?" asked one of them. "She is ill in bed," said Mbogo's next-door neighbor. "She has Iba." "The only other person is Undinpo," said another woman, "and her child is not 28 days yet." Those women whose Obirka's wife had not asked to help her with the cooking returned to their homes, and the rest went back in a body to Obirka's compound. "Whose cow was it?" asked the woman who had been allowed to stay behind. "It was my husband's," said Izaglagbo. One of the young children had opened the gate of the cowshed. Early in the afternoon, the first 2 pots of palm wine arrived from Obirka's in-laws. They were duly presented to the women, who drank a cup or 2 each to help them in their cooking. Some of it also went to the bride and her attendant maidens, who were putting the last delicate touches of razor to her coiffure and camwood on her smooth skin. When the heat of the sun began to soften, Obirka's son, Maduka, took a long broom and swept the ground in front of his father's obi. And as if they had been waiting for that, Obirka's relatives and friends began to arrive. Every man with his goatskin bag hung on one shoulder and a rolled goatskin mat under his arm. Some of them were accompanied by their sons, bearing carved wooden stools. Okonkwo was one of them. They sat in a half circle and began to talk of many things. It would not be long before the suitors came. Okonkwo brought out his snuff bottle and offered it to Obwefi Nzinwa, who sat next to him. Nzinwa took it, tapped it on his kneecap, rubbed his left palm on his body to dry it before tipping a little snuff into it. His actions were deliberate, and he spoke as he performed them. I hope our in-laws will bring many pots of wine. Although they come from a village that is known for being close-fisted, they ought to know that Oduke is the bride for a king. They dare not bring fewer than 30 pots, said Okonkwo. I shall tell them my mind if they do. At that moment, Obirka's son, Maduka, led out the giant goat from the inner compound for his father's relatives to see. They all admired it and said that was the way things should be done. The goat was then led back to the inner compound. Very soon after, the in-laws began to arrive. Young men and boys in single file, each carrying a pot of wine, came first. Obirka's relatives counted the pots as they came. 20, 25. There was a long break, and the hosts looked at each other as if to say, I told you. The host nodded in approval and seemed to say, now that they are behaving like men. Although there were 50 pots of wine, after the pot bearers came, Ibe, the suitor, and the elders of his family. They sat in a half moon, thus completing the circle with their hosts. The pots of wine stood in their midst. Then the bride, her mother, and half a dozen other women and girls emerged from the inner compound and went round the circle shaking hands with all. The bride's mother led the way, followed by the bride and the other women. The married women wore their best cloths, and the girls wore red and black waist beads and anklets of brass. When the woman retired, Obirka presented cola nuts to his in-laws. His eldest brother broke the first one, life to all of us, and he said as he broke it, and let there be friendship between your family and ours. The crowd answered, we are giving you our daughter today. She will be a good wife to you. She will bear you 9 sons like the mother of our town. The oldest man in the camp of the visitors replied, it will be good for you, and it will be good for us. This is not the first time my people have come to marry your daughter. My mother was one of you. And this will not be the last, because you understand us and we understand you. You are a great family. Preposterous men and great warriors. He looked in the direction of Okonkwo. Your daughter will bear us sons, like you. The cola was eaten, and the drinking of palm wine began. Groups of 4 or 5 men sat around with a pot in their midst. As the evening wore on, food was presented to the guests. There were huge bowls of fufu and steaming pots of soup. There were also pots of yam pottage. It was a great feast. As night fell, burning torches were set on wooden tripods, and the young men raised a song. The elders sat in a big circle, and the singers went round, singing each man's praise as they came before him. They had something to say for every man. Some were great farmers, some were orators who spoke for the clan. Okonkwo was the greatest wrestler and warrior alive. When they had gone round the circle, they settled down in the center, and the girls came from the inner compound to dance. At first the bride was not among them, but when they finally appeared, holding a cock in her right hand, a loud cheer rose from the crowd. All the other dancers made way for her. She presented the cock to the musicians and began to dance. Her brass anklets rattled as she danced, and her body gleamed with camwood in the soft yellow light. The musicians, with their wood, clay, and metal instruments, went from song to song, and they were all gay. They sang the latest song in the village. If I hold her hand, she says, don't touch. If I hold her foot, she says, don't touch. But when I hold her waist beads, she pretends not to know. The night was already far when the guests rose to go, taking their bride home to spend 7 market weeks with her suitor's family. They sang songs as they went, and on their way they paid short courtesy visits to prominent men like Okonkwo before they finally left for their village. Okonkwo made a present of 2 cocks to them.